are listening to the audiobook, The Descent, by D.M. Wright-Moore.
Most kids fall, scrape their knees, maybe shed a few tears and move on. But when this little girl fell, it wasn't onto the ground, it was into the unknown. One moment she was playing, laughing, alive. The next she plunged into a strange, infinite void where reality unraveled and the world she knew was gone. She was just a little thing, her world no bigger than the park and the laughter of her friends. Life was simple, wrapped in the warm glow of a summer afternoon. The creak of the swings and the soft shuffle of sneakers on the pavement made a kind of music, steady and sure, while the grown-ups murmured in the distance. She loved the swings most of all, the way they made her feel like the wind itself might carry her away. Every push sent her higher, and for a moment she believed she could soar right over the trees, straight into the open arms of the sky. "Higher!" she hollered, her little legs pumping with all the strength they had. The wind whipped her face, sharp and wild, as the swing climbed higher and higher. Her heart raced with the thrill of it, her stomach tumbling like a leaf caught in a breeze. She leaned back, eager to reach the sky, to touch the clouds with her fingertips. But she leaned too far. The chains bucked and twisted, the swing jerking beneath her. Before she could grab hold, her hands slipped free. For a moment, it was as if the world stopped spinning. She hung there, caught between earth and sky, floating like a feather on the wind. Then, all at once, she fell. The air rushed past her, the ground coming up fast, faster than she could think. When her head struck the earth, it made a dull, heavy sound, like a stone dropped in the stillness of a forest. Darkness should have swallowed her whole, but instead, something strange stirred. Rather than the hard, still quiet she expected, she was falling again. But this time, there wasn't a swing beneath her, or even the ground rushing to meet her, just a vast, endless nothing. Her little body plunged through a sky too big to be real, the wind screaming in her ears. The park, her friends, the whole world was gone, swallowed up by a deep, hollow emptiness. She opened her mouth to cry out, but the wind tore her voice away before it could form. Her arms thrashed, fingers clawing at the air, searching for anything to hold on to. But there was nothing, just her and the void. Time twisted and stretched, pulling longer and longer until it didn't feel like time at all. Just as her fear swelled to bursting, the nothingness began to change. Far below, a new ground took shape, but it wasn't soft earth or green grass. It was dark and sharp, shifting like a restless beast, jagged edges rolling and twisting in ways she couldn't understand. Her stomach knotted, her tiny fists clenched tight as she braced herself for the fall to end. But just before she hit, the whole world seemed to shudder and snap into place, leaving her breathless and trembling in its grip. She lay still in the dirt beneath the swing set, the ground cool and solid against her back. The noise of the park came rushing back all at once, the high-pitched giggles of children, the steady hum of cicadas, and her mother's voice, sharp and panicked, calling out, "Vesna!" She wanted to answer, but her lips wouldn't move. Something wet streaked down her face. She didn't know if it was sweat, tears, or maybe even blood. Nothing felt the same. Then her mother was there, gathering her up in gentle arms, brushing the dirt from her little dress and whispering soft, soothing words. Vesna buried her face in her mother's shoulder, her small frame shaking, her thoughts spinning with a fear too big for her young heart to hold. "I fell, Mommy," she managed to say, her voice no louder than a breath. Her mother held her tighter, stroking her hair. "I know, baby," she murmured, her voice warm and steady. But Vesna shook her head, her words trembling as they spilled out. "No, I fell big." A year passed and it happened again. She fell, just like before. It wasn't random, not really. It came after sharp moments, the slam of a door, the crack of thunder, or the bright sweep of headlights in the rain. At first, it was rare, just a flicker, like something hiding in the corner of her mind. But as time went on, those moments grew bolder, slipping in more often, like they'd been there all along, just waiting for their chance. It was the same endless fall she'd felt that day under the swing set. She'd float there, weightless and lost, stuck in a place where time seemed to disappear. Each time the episodes came, Vesna would try to ground herself, touching her wrist, reciting the names of the planets. But the void always lingered at the edges of her consciousness, waiting to pull her in again. Each time it left her weaker, her body shaking, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst free. It was like some part of her was trapped, tangled in a fragile loop that frayed a little more each time she fell. Vesna could never shake it. That strange, lost feeling like being set adrift in something too big to understand. It clung to her, a shadow she couldn't outrun, always whispering how out of place she was. No matter how she tried, she couldn't keep up. The way people laughed, the little looks they shared, the quiet jokes. It was like staring at a puzzle with half the pieces gone. She watched them from a distance, their easy way of talking and laughing together like trying to make out shapes through a frosted window. She wanted that, wanted to be part of it, to speak their language of quiet smiles and soft laughter. She tried, too, practicing smiles that never quite fit her face, offering up answers that felt borrowed from someone else's life. But no matter how hard she worked at it, the words she needed stayed hidden. When Vesna was little, she'd shuffle next door to Mrs. Grady's house whenever her folks were off working. Mrs. Grady had a kind way about her, the kind that made you feel like it was all right to let your thoughts spill out, even the ones you weren't sure how to say. She always baked cookies, warm and smelling of cinnamon, and wore a perfume that reminded Vesna of flowers. Too many flowers all crammed together, jostling for attention. Mrs. Grady's sharp eyes had a way of seeing straight through Vesna, picking up on things she didn't dare say out loud. It should have been unsettling, but it wasn't. If anything, it made Vesna feel less alone, like someone finally saw the tangled mess of her thoughts and didn't flinch. But there were things Vesna didn't talk about, things she didn't have words for. Whenever she tried, her mother's face would tighten and her eyes would slip to the floor like they were trying to run away. "You just need more rest, sweetheart," her mother would say, her voice too quick and too light, like it was trying to cover something up. Vesna didn't know what it was, but the fear in her mother's words weighed heavier than any comfort they could offer. "You're just tired," her mother would say during one of Vesna's silences. Her father would pat her hand. "You'll grow out of this." She didn't. By 16, Vesna's episodes had become unspoken family truths, something to sidestep, like a cracked tile on the kitchen floor. When they happened, her sister would shrink back. "Stop looking at me like that, you're scaring me." Her friends, brief, fleeting, would disappear when the weight of her strangeness became too heavy. They never understood. Vesna learned to keep quiet about the holes in her mind, the times when the world seemed to tilt and slide out of place. Folks wouldn't understand, and explaining only made the gaps feel wider. The slipping of reality, the strange shifts, those were her secrets to bear. By the time Vesna reached her 20s, the episodes weren't just fleeting moments of panic anymore. They were cracks, deep and jagged, running through the fabric of her world. She came to fear the little things that used to go unnoticed. The bright shimmer of sunlight through the blinds felt sharp and menacing. The slam of a door could knock her loose. Even laughter, a loud, sudden bark of it, was enough to pull her under. She tried to explain it once, sitting at her mother's kitchen table with a steaming cup of tea clutched in her trembling hands. "It's like I'm falling," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Not fainting. It's real. The world just disappears. And I'm nowhere." Her mother's face didn't soften like Vesna hoped it would. Instead, her lips pressed into a thin, tight line, her voice calm but distant. "You've always had a vivid imagination, Vesna. Stress does strange things to the mind." That's how it always went. Friends, doctors, therapists. They all had answers that didn't fit. Panic attacks, they called it. Dissociation. They ran tests, scanned her brain, handed her pills that dulled her edges but never reached the heart of it. But Vesna knew better. This wasn't something you could explain away with logic or pin down with words. It wasn't a problem to solve, not one that anyone else could understand. It was real, but in a way that belonged only to her, hidden beneath the surface where no one could reach. She'd made her peace with it, or as much peace as a body could. She found her own way of managing, slipping into a rhythm that kept the worst of it at bay. It worked well enough, until that one fateful day. That day the morning matched her mood, heavy and still like most of her days. She sat with her coffee, watching the grey skyline through the smudged window. The towers rose in perfect rows, one after another, cold and lifeless. She thought of herself as one of them, not tall, not remarkable, just there, rooted in place while the world moved on around her. She brought the cup to her lips, the rim brushing her hand. That's when she saw it, just a flicker at first, something bright out of the corner of her eye. She turned her head, her breath catching. There, outside the patio window, a red mylar balloon in the shape of a heart floated against the endless grey. It shouldn't have been there. Its colour was too vivid, its presence too strange. The string dangled slack, but the balloon didn't move, as if it was tied to nothing at all. Vesna couldn't look away. Her chest tightened, her pulse quickening with a kind of fear she couldn't name. Vesna moved slow, careful, like she was coaxing a stray pup to trust her. Her heart hammered in her chest as she edged closer to the balloon, gripping a broomstick tight in her hands. She gave it a cautious nudge, her fingers trembling on the handle. The balloon wavered, then slipped free, floating lazy-like into the wide open sky. She stood still, watching it drift off, its bright colours cutting through the dull grey morning. For a moment, a sweet, strange feeling rose in her chest, like she could drift away too. With a shaky breath, she turned back toward the kitchen, back to her coffee and the comfort of walls. She sipped, her gaze wandering absently out the window, drawn again to the balloon. The wind toyed with it, carrying it in circles. Vesna tracked its path idly, until her heart clenched. Power lines. The dark cables stretched across the sky like taut spiderwebs, humming with a quiet menace. The balloon wavered, dipping and twirling in the breeze, its red surface a glowing ember against the dull backdrop. No, 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 no! Her coffee cup trembled in her hands. She set it down, her fingers slick with sweat. Her chest tightened as the balloon floated closer to the lines, oblivious to the threat. Vesna's mind screamed at her to act, to shout for someone, anyone, to intervene. But the street below was still, empty, indifferent. Her breath came fast now, shallow and panicked. It won't happen, it can't happen. It's just a balloon, The balloon touched the line. A flash of blinding light swallowed the sky, sharp and searing, followed by a crack so loud it seemed to split the air in two. Sparks erupted like violent fireworks, arcing wildly. Vesna flinched and squeezed her eyes shut in preparation of the inevitable vertigo of weightlessness. But it did not come. This time it was different. Vesna felt it start slow, like she was being tugged through a thread of cold, slippery glass. Her skin prickled, her nerves stretched tight, humming like a plucked string. Time itself seemed to press in, heavy and strange, folding over her and then pulling back again, each wave making her head spin and her stomach turn. She noticed a taste of copper lingering on her tongue. She pressed her fingers to her lips, her nose, but there was no blood. When Vesna opened her eyes, she found herself still in her kitchen, but it wasn't right. Not really. The coffee cup sat where she'd left it, steam curling in the air, but the way it swirled was too slow, too thick, like the air itself had turned to syrup. The walls were the same pale yellow, but the colour seemed to hum faintly, almost alive, and the ticking of the clock was off, like it couldn't decide whether to rush or drag. The silence was heavier here, pressing down on her chest until she could hardly breathe. It wasn't her kitchen, not the one she knew. It was close. so close it hurt. But every detail felt bent, stretched, twisted just enough to make her stomach churn and her skin crawl. Did it happen? She looked down at her hands, her nails pressed deep into her palms, little crescents of pain biting into her skin. The ache steadied her, kept her rooted. It felt real. It had to be real. There was no falling, no weightless pull, no rushing air tearing at her. But something still wasn't right. A strange emptiness lingered, an absence she couldn't name, like the room had lost a piece of itself. Her eyes darted to the window. It was open. She didn't remember opening it. A chill crept through, cold and biting, snaking around her arms and neck. Vesna turned quickly, her pulse quickening. The sound of a door creaking shut echoed faintly, too far away, too soft, like it was retreating, like it wasn't just a door at all. "Who's there?" Vesna whispered, her voice weak and scratchy, like it didn't belong to her anymore. It came out small, trembling, barely more than a croak in the stillness. Her throat burned as though the words had scraped their way out. There was no answer. She staggered back, her chair legs screeching against the floor like nails on metal. Her stomach twisted hard, a sick churning knot deep inside her, as if her body knew something her mind couldn't catch up to. She stumbled to the open window, desperate for air. "It's fine," she muttered to herself, her voice shaky, breaking the oppressive stillness. Just breathe. Get some air." But when she leaned out, the world outside wasn't right. It looked the same, the grey towers standing stark against the grey sky. But it was too still, like the city had been frozen in place. The breeze didn't stir the leaves, the shadows didn't shift, and even the faint hum of distant traffic was gone. It felt flat, lifeless, like staring into a photograph. Her legs wobbled beneath her as she backed away from the window. "I need to get out," she whispered, her breath hitching, her pulse pounding in her ears. The kitchen felt too small, too close, like the walls were leaning in on her. "I'll just go outside. It's fine. It's fine." But then she froze. On the wall in the hall, something moved. A reflection. Her reflection. Her heart stopped. It was her, or almost her. The face staring back had her hair, her features, but they weren't right. The skin was too smooth, like polished porcelain. The mouth was stretched wide, the corners pulling too far back. Its eyes, her eyes, locked onto hers and didn't blink. Then the reflection tilted its head, slow and deliberate, its movements like a marionette. Its mouth moved, but the voice that came wasn't hers. It was low and warped, like the thick air had learned to speak. "Are you me?" it had asked. Vesna's heart hammered in her chest as she bolted, the fear coursing through her like wildfire. She reached for the door, but her hand fumbled. Wrong side. The handle wasn't where it should have been. For a moment she hesitated, her mind tripping over the strangeness of it. Then she yanked it open and burst outside into a world that didn't seem to know her anymore. She ran, her breath tearing in and out, her chest burning. The streets flew by, but they weren't right. Not the streets she'd grown up on, walked 1,000 times. The corner store, with its old green awning that always sagged in the wind, now wore a bright red one, the letters above it curling and twisting into shapes that almost meant something. She blinked, but they didn't settle. Signs hung crooked, their words scrambled like a foreign cipher. She passed the diner, only it wasn't. The windows were too small, the door set into a wall where no door had any business being. Her legs felt ready to give out, but she couldn't stop, wouldn't stop. Around the corner she spotted a steeple stabbing into the sky, and for a fleeting second, relief fluttered in her chest. But when she got closer, her stomach dropped. It wasn't the library. The old, familiar building with its creaky steps and the smell of musty paper was gone. In its place stood a church, cold and towering, like it had been there all along. She stumbled, her thoughts tangling. Everything shifted the harder she tried to make sense of it, like the world itself was playing a trick. The pavement beneath her feet felt too hard, too smooth, like it didn't want her to belong. The grass she stepped on wasn't soft and springy. It cracked under her shoes, dry and brittle, as if it wasn't real. The air clung to her, thick and heavy, though it shouldn't have. And the people, oh, the people walked past her, their smiles too wide, their eyes too sharp, lingering on her like they knew something she didn't. They stared just a little too long, their heads turning to follow her as she passed, like they were waiting for her to figure it out. But Vesna didn't want to figure it out. She just wanted to wake up. Vesna spotted Mrs. Grady by the corner, her market basket swinging easy from her arm. Relief swept over her, cool and steady, like a creek running through the heat of a summer day. Mrs. Grady was steady as stone, familiar, a piece of the world that still made sense. Vesna hurried over, her words tumbling out before she could catch her breath. "Mrs. Grady, it's me, Vesna. How are you?" The old woman turned slow, her head tilting just a little too far, and then came that smile, a wide, stretched thing that didn't seem to belong to her face. "Oh, Vesna, it's been far too long," she said, her voice smooth and warm but slick somehow, like honey that had started to sour. "And how are you, my dear?" Vesna faltered, stumbling over her words, trying to put into them the strange weight she'd felt all day. She told Mrs. Grady about it, about how the air felt thick and nothing is what it used to be. But Mrs. Grady only nodded, her smile pinned in place, her eyes fixed on Vesna like she was reading a story written on her face. "Isn't it just lovely today?" Mrs. Grady said, her voice bright and cheery, cutting right across Vesna's words. "The air feels so fresh." Fresh. Vesna's chest tightened. The air wasn't fresh, it was heavy, pressing down like a storm about to break. Her stomach churned. "Mrs. Grady," she whispered, leaning in, "have you noticed anything strange?" For a moment everything went still. Mrs. Grady just smiled, her eyes steady and unblinking, the kind of silence that stretched too long. The laugh came sharp and jagged like the bark of a fox caught in a trap. "Oh, Vesna, you always did have such an imagination," Mrs. Grady said, but the words didn't sit right. They felt borrowed, like they'd been taken from some other time, some other moment. Vesna shifted back a step, her pulse drumming in her ears. "Mrs. Grady, are you okay?" The woman's smile cracked just for a heartbeat, her eyebrows drawing together like storm clouds. She leaned in, close enough that Vesna could see the fine lines webbing her face. Her lips moved, shaping something small, something soft, a word Vesna couldn't quite catch. It wasn't English, it wasn't anything she knew, but the look in Mrs. Grady's eyes rooted Vesna to the spot, her breath catching in her throat. Then Mrs. Grady straightened, smoothing out her face like nothing had ever been wrong. "Well now, Vesna, you take care," she said, her voice as bright as the sun breaking through clouds. She turned and walked off, her steps too steady, too measured. Vesna stood there, still as a stone. That word, whatever it was, kept circling in her head, a whisper she couldn't quite catch. The ground beneath her felt like it was tilting, the trees growing tall and wild, their gnarled branches clawing at a sky that looked like an old bruise. Her chest tightened as if the air had thickened, each breath harder to draw. She wanted to run. But where? The world was closing in on her, bending and twisting like a storm that wouldn't quit. And then it hit her soft and sure like the first warm light after a bitter winter. This place wasn't some strange land. It was hers. All of it. The dark shadows, the warped faces, the hollow, aching loneliness. They weren't just here. They were her. They were the fears she'd tucked away, the hurts she'd carried since the day she fell off that swing so many years ago. Her legs buckled, and she sank to the ground, the weight of it all spilling out in heavy sobs. The tears came like a flood, and with every one the world around her shifted. The trees blurred, the shadows faded, and the ground beneath her sharpened. Slowly, the twisted world unraveled, melting into something entirely new. something waiting to be understood. The ground under Vesna's feet wasn't solid at all. It bucked and rolled like a wild animal trapped in too small a cage, its sharp edges grinding and twisting. It groaned and shifted, a restless, dark thing that seemed alive. Vesna stood frozen, her heart hammering and catching in her throat. Deep down, somewhere beyond thought, she knew what she had to do. It wasn't something she reasoned out. It was like knowing how to blink, how to breathe, pure, bone-deep instinct. She stood up and stretched out her arms, her fingers trembling like leaves in a storm. Her eyes lifted to the sky, a swirling, hungry thing that seemed ready to swallow her whole. And then she let go, let herself fall backward, weightless, into the writhing, jagged mass below. The moment she hit, a burst of light exploded behind her eyes, bright enough to drown out everything else. Then, just like that, it was gone. She was lying on the cool, smooth floor of her kitchen. The faint scent of coffee hung in the air, warm and familiar. The steady tick of the clock filled the quiet, grounding her. It was her kitchen, just her kitchen. For a long time she lay there, the linoleum cold against her back. She didn't dare move, couldn't even cry. Finally she reached out, her hand brushing the corner of the table, the solidness of it grounding her. She let out a long, shuddering breath. She was home.